Imagine being tied to a thick rope, your bare chest pressed against cold wood, and hundreds of eyes watching in silence. The air smells of salt, sweat, and fear. Then, without warning, you're thrown overboard. In a single heartbeat, icy water fills your lungs as the rope tightens around your body, dragging you beneath a warship's massive hull. The darkness below is endless. You try to scream, but seawater rushes into your throat. Razor-sharp barnacles scrape across your skin like shattered glass, tearing through flesh, muscle, and bone. By the time you're pulled back up, your body is barely recognizable. The crew stares in horror, but the captain? He doesn't even flinch. If you're lucky, he'll order the rope cut and end it quickly. If not, you'll be sent under again. This wasn't torture from a pirate's nightmare. It was real, an official punishment used for centuries by powerful navies across Europe. A ritual of control so cruel that even hardened sailors begged for death instead. It was called keelhauling, and it became the most feared punishment ever carried out at sea. But how did such a horrifying practice exist for so long? Why did men who commanded nations believe this was justice? To answer that, we need to step back into a time when the open ocean was less a path to adventure and more a floating prison ruled by fear. To understand why punishments like keelhauling even existed, you first need to imagine what life was really like aboard a warship in the 1600s. It wasn't the romantic image of brave sailors and glorious battles you see in movies. It was closer to a floating prison, where every day was a struggle to survive. Hundreds of men were crammed into spaces smaller than a modern apartment. The air below deck was thick with smoke, sweat, and rot. There was no privacy, no silence, just the endless groaning of the ship and the stench of human misery. Food, usually infested with worms. Bread turned to stone after weeks at sea. The water was rationed carefully, often thick and green with slime. Disease spread like wildfire, scurvy, dysentery, fever. If one man got sick, the whole crew was at risk. And yet none of this was considered punishment, it was just life at sea. Most of these men hadn't even chosen to be there. Many were pressed into service, forced to join the navy against their will. Others were drifters or criminals, desperate enough to trade freedom for a meal. The ocean was their prison, and their captain was the warden. Every command from an officer had to be obeyed instantly. A single hesitation could be seen as defiance. Anger the wrong man, and you might be flogged, starved, or chained to the deck in full sun for hours. But the greatest threat wasn't disease or battle. It was the system of discipline that ruled these ships, a system built entirely on fear. Captains knew they commanded men who hated them, men who might mutiny at the first chance. So, they ruled through terror. Punishments were public, violent, and unforgettable. They weren't just meant to hurt the guilty, they were meant to scare everyone else. And that's where keelhauling came in. It was the ultimate warning, the nightmare whispered through the lower decks at night. Sailors knew that if they disobeyed orders, stole food, or simply angered the wrong officer, the next splash overboard might be their own. But how did such horror become an official part of naval law? To find out, we have to go back to where it all began, the birth of the nightmare known as keelhauling. Long before the age of steam and iron, the oceans were ruled by wood, wind, and fear. Among the Dutch fleets of the late 1500s, a rumour began to circle through the lower decks. A punishment so cruel that even hardened sailors refused to speak its name aloud. They called it keelhalen, meaning to haul under teed. A keel. No one knows the exact moment it began. Some say the Dutch invented it during their wars for independence, using terror to keep discipline aboard their new naval empire. Others believe it started informally, an improvised act of vengeance by a furious captain that later became official policy. What we do know is that by 1560, Dutch naval regulations were already describing it in detail. That's right, this horror wasn't a secret torture, it was written into law. At a time when Europe's navies were expanding into global powers, order had to be absolute. Crews were massive, tempers short, and resources scarce. The seas offered no second chances. A single act of disobedience could doom an entire ship. So commanders searched for a punishment so unforgettable, so public, that it would crush rebellion before it even began. Keelhauling became that answer. It was part execution, part spectacle, and part ritual. Everything about it was designed to break a man's spirit, and to remind everyone watching who truly held power on the open sea. The Dutch Navy, feared and respected across the world, soon became notorious for this method, and like most things in history, cruelty spreads faster than compassion. Within decades, the British, French, and other European fleets began copying it. Each navy added its own twist. Some dragged victims from bow to stern, others from one side of the ship to the other. The distances changed, but the outcome rarely did. The result was agony, or death. To the officers, keelhauling wasn't barbaric, it was necessary. They believed fear was the only language sailors understood, and this was fear in its purest form. But if the origins of keelhauling sound disturbing, the procedure itself was even worse. It wasn't just punishment, it was a carefully engineered descent into hell. And once you hear how it was carried out, you'll understand why sailors whispered about it like a curse that could pull them under at any moment. Once a sailor was sentenced to keelhauling, his fate was sealed long before the rope touched his skin. Orations began days in advance, turning the ship itself into an execution ground. The officers chose the ropes carefully, thick, heavy, and strong enough to drag a full-grown man beneath the hull without snapping. The crew whispered among themselves, glancing nervously toward the sea. Nobody wanted to make eye contact with the condemned. It was bad luck. When the day arrived, the entire crew was ordered on deck. Attendance wasn't optional. Every man had to watch, because that was the point. Keelhauling wasn't just punishment, it was theatre. The condemned sailor stood barefoot on the planks, stripped to the waist so the salt water would burn deeper. Sometimes he was blindfolded, but more often he wasn't. The officers wanted him to see the faces of the men who would pull the rope. A thick line was passed under the ship's hull, from one side to the other. The sailor's arms were bound tight to his body, and the rope was looped around his chest and shoulders. In some cases, weights were tied to his feet, small cannonballs, anchor chain, anything heavy enough to pull him down fast. When the captain gave the signal, the drummers began their slow, steady beat. One side of the crew hauled hard on the rope, the other released it. The sailor went overboard. The first plunge stole the breath from his lungs. The North Sea was often freezing, and the shock alone could stop a man's heart. Then the rope tightened, dragging him down deeper and deeper into darkness. Below the surface, there was no light, no direction, only panic. He fought for air that didn't exist. His body smashed against the ship's hull, and that's when the real agony began. The bottom of those old wooden ships wasn't smooth. It was covered with barnacles and mussels, hard shells as sharp as broken glass. As his body scraped across them, skin peeled away in long ribbons. Salt water rushed into open wounds. The pain was beyond screaming. If he didn't drown first, he might make it under the keel, where the water pressure was strongest, and then, just as suddenly, he'd be yanked upward on the opposite side. To the crew, it seemed like hours. In reality, the entire ordeal might last less than 3 minutes. But when the man's body broke the surface again, it was like seeing someone rise from the dead. Some emerged limp and silent, unconscious or worse. Others screamed, their voices raw and broken. Blood turned the seawater red. The surgeon, if there was one, rushed forward, but in this era, medicine offered little mercy. Wounds were washed with salt water or vinegar. Flesh was burned shut with hot tar. There were no clean tools, no anesthesia, only the sound of muffled sobs and waves hitting the hull. And yet, for some men, it wasn't over. Their sentence demanded a second or even third passage beneath the keel. That meant being dragged again through the same agony while still bleeding from the first. Few survived more than one. But those who did were marked forever. Their bodies carried scars like maps of suffering, proof that they'd looked death in the eye and somehow come back. And for everyone who watched, the message was clear. Obedience wasn't a choice, it was survival. Still, there's one haunting question left unanswered. Who decided who lived and who died? The truth lies with the men who held absolute power, the captains themselves. For most sailors, one trip beneath the keel was enough to end everything, but some captains didn't see it that way. They believed a single punishment was too merciful, that the fear of death wasn't nearly as powerful as prolonged pain. So instead of ending it, they ordered the rope thrown again. The surviving sailor, barely conscious, would be dragged back onto the deck, his skin shredded, his lungs burning with seawater. The ship's surgeon might pour vinegar over the wounds, not to heal them, but to keep him alive just long enough for what came next. Then the captain would give the command. The The same man who had just cheated death was sent under a gain. Imagine it, being forced beneath that ship once more, every cut reopening as salt water bit into raw flesh. The mind breaking before the body ever did. The second pass was almost always fatal, but if a man somehow surfaced again, gasping and bleeding, he'd meet only the cold stares of his shipmates. No one dared help him. Compassion was mutiny, but on some ships, even two wasn't enough. Historical records from the Dutch and British navies describe men being keel-hauled 3 times in a single day, their bodies torn apart by the very vessel they had once served. The officers stood and watched it all, silent and expressionless, as if witnessing the weather rather than a human being's final moments. Because that's what the Navy demanded, obedience over empathy. And if the condemned man somehow survived all of it, if by some impossible chance he lived through the second or third pass, he didn't walk away a free man. He was branded, flogged, or abandoned on some distant coast, left to die slowly rather than quickly. His suffering became a message that would echo through every deck and cabin of the fleet. This is what happens to those who disobey. But not every sailor went to the rope because of mutiny or crime. Some faced the keel for reasons far stranger and far more unjust. On paper, keel hauling was reserved for the worst offences: mutiny, desertion, or attacking an officer. But at sea, paper didn't matter. The captain's word was law, and law could shift with the tide. In the world of wooden ships and endless oceans, a captain wasn't just a leader, he was a god. His voice could save a man or condemn him. No court, no jury, no appeal. The only witness was the sea itself. That power created monsters. History remembers the Dutch Navy for perfecting the ritual of keel hauling, but the truth is far uglier. Some captains used it as a tool of fear, a way to silence complaints, rebellion, or simply remind the crew who ruled the ship. The crime could be almost anything. Answering back, falling asleep on duty, dropping a rope at the wrong time. Nothing at all. Imagine being hundreds of miles from land, trapped on a vessel where even a glance the wrong way could seal your fate. The ocean became a floating dictatorship, and keel hauling was its execution decree. But it wasn't always done out of anger. Sometimes it was performance. Captains wanted to show strength, to make an example that would echo across the fleet. They'd gather the entire crew on deck, watching their faces twist with fear as the condemned man disappeared beneath the waves. And if a captain was feeling merciful, he might stop the punishment halfway through. Not out of kindness, but because watching someone almost die was more effective than watching someone die completely. It was a perfect system of control. Pain for the disobedient, terror for the obedient. Some historical accounts even describe captains laughing during the process, drunk on authority, detached from humanity. They believed cruelty maintained order. And in a world where storms, pirates, and disease already took countless lives, fear became the Navy's most reliable weapon. But there were exceptions, moments when even hardened sailors began to question what they were forced to witness. Some secretly whispered that keel hauling wasn't punishment at all, it was murder disguised as discipline. And those whispers would eventually grow loud enough to shake the very foundations of naval power itself. You'd think something as barbaric as keel hauling would vanish quickly, that sailors, commanders, or even kings would finally say, enough. But it didn't. For almost 200 years, it survived. Not because it worked, but because it terrified people into obedience. The ocean was chaos. Storms that could sink a ship in seconds, diseases that wiped out half a crew, and pirates who gave no mercy. In that kind of world, discipline wasn't just important, it was survival. And fear was the easiest way to maintain it. Captains believed kindness led to weakness. They saw mercy as dangerous, compassion as a crack in the hull that could destroy the ship from within. So they turned pain into order, fear into loyalty, and cruelty into policy. Every sailor who witnessed a keel hauling walked away changed. They didn't just remember the blood or the screams, they remembered what happened to those who stepped out of line. That memory did the work of 1,000 chains. It silenced questions, it crushed complaints, it made men obey orders that deep down they knew were wrong. And the higher powers, the admirals, the kings, the naval boards, they didn't stop it because fear made their ships efficient. A terrified sailor rowed harder, fought longer, and never hesitated to obey. To them, it wasn't cruelty, it was strategy. The logic was simple and horrifyingly effective. If one man suffers, 100 others will never disobey. And that belief, that pain preserves power, became the foundation of naval discipline for generations. Even when the age of sail faded and the world grew more civilized, echoes of keelhauling lingered. The method changed, but the mindset didn't. Fear remained the most convenient form of control. Because whether on land or sea, history has always shown one truth. When leaders can rule through fear, they almost never choose anything else. But eventually, even the strongest systems of terror begin to crack. And when sailors started to speak out, when they began to question the justice of their captains, the tides of history began to turn. For centuries, the ocean swallowed screams. No one questioned the captain, no one defied the rope. But even fear has limits, and even the sea can grow tired of blood. By the late 1700s, the world was changing. The Enlightenment had begun, an age where philosophers, scientists, and thinkers started asking dangerous questions. Questions like, what gives one man the right to torture another? Is obedience worth the loss of humanity? In cities and parliaments, debates about justice reached the same naval powers that had once ruled by terror. And slowly, painfully, the tides began to turn. Some captains refused to keelhaul, calling it unfit for civilized men. Others began to see that broken sailors made poor warriors. Even hardened officers started to realize that a man who fights from loyalty is stronger than a man who fights from fear. But change didn't come all at once. It took mutinies, reformers, and decades of moral awakening. It took writers and witnesses describing the horrors of keelhauling in words so vivid that even those far from the sea could feel the salt, the blood, and the terror in their throats. In the Netherlands, the very nation that had birthed keelhauling, the Dutch Navy finally outlawed it in 1853. Britain, which had long clung to it in its naval codebooks, followed in 1861. By then, ships were powered by steam instead of sails, and humanity had started to believe that discipline didn't need to mean destruction. But make no mistake, the scars remained. The men who had been dragged under those hulls carried the memory of that horror until their final breaths. And even though the rope was cut, the idea behind it, that fear keeps order, never truly disappeared. Today the word keelhauling survives only as a metaphor, a phrase for being harshly punished, humiliated, or torn apart by criticism. But behind that single word lies centuries of real agony, real men, and a system that proved how easily cruelty can be justified when wrapped in the flag of discipline. Keelhauling was more than punishment. It was a warning, from history itself, that when fear becomes tradition and authority goes unchecked, humanity sinks beneath the waves. The waves that once washed blood from wooden decks are calm now. The ships that carried screams across the ocean are gone, rotted, broken, or resting quietly beneath the sea. But their stories still echo through time. Keelhauling was supposed to be forgotten, buried under centuries of progress. Yet it remains more than a chapter in naval history. It's a mirror, one that reflects something deeply human and deeply dangerous. Because what kept keelhauling alive for 300 years wasn't just cruelty, it was belief. The belief that fear keeps order, that pain creates obedience, that those in power have the right to destroy those beneath them, if it means preserving control. That belief didn't drown with the old ships. It survives, in boardrooms, battlefields, prisons, and politics. Wherever fear is used to silence, to dominate, to command, the ghost of keelhauling still lingers in the shadows. And that's the real horror, not the barnacles, not the ropes, but the reminder that once brutality becomes normal, it can last for generations, not because people love it, but because they stop questioning it. The ocean teaches lessons in pain and endurance. And from the depths of its history, keel hauling leaves us one truth carved in salt and scar. When we trade humanity for control, when obedience matters more than compassion, we all sink together. So remember this: the next time someone justifies cruelty in the name of order or fear in the name of discipline, think of the men who were dragged beneath the keels of their own ships. And ask yourself, how deep must we go before we finally learn to come up for air?